There are moments in history when the world tilts on its axis, when the established order, seemingly permanent, seemingly inevitable, reveals itself to be nothing more than elaborate theater. April 1945 was such a moment. In Bavaria that spring, you might have heard distant thunder of Allied bombs falling on Munich, 20 miles away. But in one particular garden, sheltered by ancient oaks and manicured hedges, a 10-year-old girl named Gudrun Himmler played with her dolls, seemingly untouched by the approaching storm. Consider what that garden represented. It was a bubble of privilege, maintained by unimaginable violence, a greenhouse of exotic flowers that could only exist because of the machinery of death operating just beyond the hedgerows. Within weeks, that bubble would burst. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The greenhouse metaphor is not merely poetic, it describes a precise ecological reality. Just as tropical orchids cannot survive a sudden frost, these children had been cultivated in conditions so artificial, so removed from normal human experience, that they possessed no defenses against the world that was about to rush in. Gudrun's father, Heinrich Himmler, had created for his daughter a paradise built on bones. She attended the finest schools, wore dresses imported from Paris, celebrated birthdays with chocolate cakes at a time when most German children subsisted on potato soup. Her reality was constructed from lies so elaborate, so carefully maintained, that she believed her father worked in agriculture, growing things, nurturing life. The architecture of this deception required constant maintenance. Imagine the effort involved in keeping a child ignorant when her father commanded the SS, when he designed the very machinery of the Holocaust. Every conversation had to be curated, every newspaper hidden, every radio broadcast monitored. The fathers of these children had built two separate realities, the one they inhabited at work, where they calculated death rates and shipping schedules for human cargo, and the one they returned to each evening, where they dandled children on their knees and read bedtime stories. Across Berlin, in a villa that would soon become rubble, 6 other children lived in a similar bubble. The Goebbels children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Haida, ranged in age from 4 to 12. Their names had been chosen deliberately, all beginning with H, a tribute to the Führer, who was their father's obsession. These children played in rooms lined with stolen art, ate from china that once graced Jewish homes, slept in beds requisitioned from families who no longer needed them because they no longer existed. Their mother Magda photographed them constantly, creating images of Aryan perfection for propaganda magazines. The children smiled for the cameras, unaware they were advertisements for an ideology that would soon collapse into ash. 20 miles to the south, in a castle that resembled something from a fairy tale, 8-year-old Edda Goering lived surrounded by treasures her father had looted from across occupied Europe. Hermann Goering had been systematic in his theft. Vermeer paintings hung in the dining room, Rubens in the library, sculptures by Rodin in the gardens. Young Edda walked past masterpieces worth millions as casually as other children walked past their family photographs. Her father called her his sunshine, and indeed she illuminated his life in a way that nothing else could. He was a man who ordered cities bombed from the sky, yet he personally selected toys for his daughter from confiscated Jewish toy stores. The mathematics of this world were brutal and precise. Approximately 8,000 children belonged to families of high-ranking Nazi officials, children whose parents held positions that made them directly complicit in genocide. These were not the children of ordinary soldiers or even ordinary war criminals. These were the sons and daughters of architects, of planners, of those who sat in comfortable offices and calculated how many human beings could be processed per hour at specific facilities. Consider the layers of privilege that insulated these children. First came material wealth, mansions, servants, unlimited food in a starving nation. Second came social status. Their fathers were celebrities within the Reich, recognized wherever they went, their children treated as royalty. Third came ideological protection. They were raised to believe their fathers were building a 1,000-year empire, that they were on the winning side of history, that they represented humanity's future. Every layer of this privilege would soon be stripped away. But in April 1945, most of these children still believed the fairy tale. The speed of collapse when it came was extraordinary. Empires typically take decades to fall, but the Nazi state imploded in weeks. By late April, Soviet forces were fighting street by street through Berlin. The sound of artillery was no longer distant thunder. It was immediate, visceral, shaking the foundations of buildings. In the Reich Chancellery bunker, 50 feet beneath the garden where the Goebbels children once played, their parents made a decision that would haunt history. Josef and Magda Goebbels decided their children would not survive the Reich's defeat. They had already obtained the cyanide capsules. Try to imagine the psychology required for such a choice. These were not improvised decisions made in panic. They were calculated, discussed, planned. Magda Goebbels consulted with Hitler's personal physician about the most painless method. She wanted her children's deaths to be gentle, as if gentleness could somehow absolve the act itself. The capsules were small, easily hidden in food or drink. The children would taste something bitter, perhaps, and then nothing. Forever nothing. On the 1st of May, 1945, as Soviet troops closed within blocks of the bunker, Magda Goebbels led her children down the concrete stairs for the last time. They descended from the spring sunshine into artificial light, from the world of the living into a tomb. The children had been told they were going to a safe place, that the soldiers outside were bad men who wanted to hurt them. In a sense, both statements were true. They were in the safest place their mother could imagine, death before dishonor, death before facing the consequences of their father's actions, death before the bubble burst completely. What happened in those final hours remains documented in the testimonies of bunker survivors. The children were given cocoa laced with sedatives. Once drowsy, once trusting, the cyanide capsules were crushed between their teeth. Helga, the eldest at 12, may have struggled. The autopsy would later show bruising. But within minutes, all 6 children lay dead on their bunks. Their mother had killed them with the same methodical efficiency their father had applied to propaganda. The bubble hadn't burst. It had been deliberately collapsed from within. While the Goebbels children died in their bunker tomb, other Nazi children faced different fates, determined by factors beyond their control. Geography mattered immensely. Children in Bavaria, where Gudrun Himmler lived, faced American forces who generally took prisoners and processed them through established systems. Children in the East faced Soviet troops whose homeland had been devastated by German invasion, whose rage was righteous and terrible. The randomness of survival depended on which army arrived first. Financial resources created diverging paths. Families with Swiss bank accounts had options. They could bribe, they could relocate, they could purchase new identities. The Bormann children, 10 of them scattered across Bavaria as their father disappeared into legend, had access to hidden funds that would finance their escapes. Within 72 hours of Germany's surrender, these children would be divided and sent to 3 different continents, their identities already being rewritten by forgers working from pre-prepared plans. But money couldn't buy everything. Edda Goering watched American soldiers ransack her fairy tale castle, carrying out paintings and sculptures, loading trucks with her family's treasures. She clutched her favorite doll, the only possession she was allowed to keep, while strangers walked through her home, pointing and laughing at the excess. For a child raised in privilege, this inversion of power was psychologically catastrophic. Yesterday, soldiers had saluted her father. Today, they were stealing her toys. The role of parents in determining children's fates cannot be overstated. Some Nazi officials, realizing defeat was inevitable, made preparations. They created escape routes, established contacts with sympathetic clergy, arranged for money transfers to foreign accounts. They gave their children language training, false identity papers, and detailed instructions on what to say if captured. These parents, however monstrous their crimes, at least provided their children with survival tools. Other parents chose differently. Beyond the Goebbels family, several other high-ranking Nazis attempted or completed family murder-suicides. The logic was consistent. Better death than shame, better oblivion than facing the judgment of history. These parents believed so completely in their ideology that they saw their children's deaths as mercy rather than murder. They could not imagine a world where their children might grow beyond their parents' crimes, might choose different paths, might redeem the family name through opposite action. Heinrich Himmler chose a third path, attempted escape, then suicide when captured, leaving his daughter to face the consequences alone. When Gudrun saw her father for the last time, he told her to remember him as a good man who had only done his duty. Then he vanished into the chaos of Germany's collapse. Within weeks, he would be dead by his own hand, a cyanide capsule crushed between his teeth during a British interrogation. But Gudrun would live, carrying his final words like stones in her pockets. By May 8, 1945, when Germany officially surrendered, the transformation was already underway. The children of Nazi royalty had become history's most hunted orphans in a matter of days. Those who survived faced a world that had no sympathy for them, that saw them as extensions of their parents' crimes, that wanted answers they were too young to provide. The greenhouse had shattered completely, and the exotic flowers that had bloomed in its artificial climate now faced bitter winds without protection. Some children were too young to understand what had happened. 4-year-old Martin Bormann Jr. would grow up with fragmented memories of his father, unable to distinguish between reality and the stories told by relatives trying to protect him. Other children, like Gudrun Himmler at 10, were old enough to remember paradise but too young to understand why it had ended. They would spend years, decades even, trying to reconcile the father who had been kind to them with the father who had been monstrous to millions. The psychological impact of such rapid collapse defies easy description. Imagine your entire world, not just your family, but your nation, your ideology, your understanding of right and wrong, revealed as false within weeks. Imagine being told that your beloved father, who tucked you in at night and played games with you, was responsible for atrocities beyond comprehension. The cognitive dissonance would be crushing. Many of these children would spend their entire lives trying to resolve this contradiction, and many would fail. Yet in that failure lies something profoundly human. These children were innocent of their parents' crimes, yet they would carry the weight of those crimes forever. They did not choose their families, did not choose to be born into history's darkest chapter, did not choose the names that would mark them for life. Their survival was both blessing and curse. They lived. But they lived with knowledge that would haunt their dreams and shape their identities in ways both visible and hidden. As spring turned to summer in 1945, as the full scope of Nazi atrocities began to emerge through liberating armies' reports and survivors' testimonies, these children faced a question that would define their lives. What do you do when you discover your father is a monster? Some would spend decades denying the truth. Others would embrace it, dedicating their lives to atonement. Still others would vanish, hoping that new names and new countries might offer escape from inherited shame. The moment when paradise burned created approximately 8,000 individual stories, each unique yet connected by shared trauma. These children scattered across the globe like seeds from an exploding pod, carrying within them the DNA of perpetrators, but also the possibility of transformation. Their journeys would take them from Bavarian cabins to Argentine estancias, from monastery orphanages to American suburbs, from German prisons to African plains. But every journey would begin in that same moment, when the greenhouse shattered, when the bubble burst, when the world they knew ended and an uncertain future began. Vanishing is a science. Not magic, not luck, science. It requires planning, resources, and above all, precision. In the final days of the Reich, as smoke rose from burning documents and officials swallowed cyanide capsules, a parallel operation unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Pre-planned escape routes activated like dominoes falling in sequence, each element triggering the next in a choreography designed months or even years earlier. Consider the logistics involved. You cannot simply walk 8,000 children across borders without preparation. You need safe houses, forged documents, sympathetic contacts, and above all, money. The Nazis, despite their impending defeat, had prepared for this possibility with characteristic thoroughness. Networks had been established, codes agreed upon, emergency funds deposited in neutral countries. When the moment came, these systems activated with the same efficiency that had once moved millions toward death camps, but now moving perpetrators' families toward freedom. The Odessa network represents perhaps the most organized of these escape routes. The name itself, Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, Organization of Former SS Members, tells you everything about its purpose. Within hours of Hitler's death, this network began moving high-ranking families through a series of safe houses, each link in the chain carefully prepared. Monastery guest rooms became temporary refugees. Priests who had sympathized with fascism now provided something more valuable than prayers. They provided silence. In 6 weeks, 47 high-ranking families moved through this network. Imagine the coordination required. Each family needed different documentation, different cover stories, different destinations. Children had to be coached on their new identities, taught to respond to unfamiliar names, drilled on fabricated family histories. 10-year-old Wolf Rudiger Hess, son of Hitler's deputy, learned to answer to 3 different names, depending on which checkpoint they approached. At the American checkpoint, he was Hans Schmidt, son of a schoolteacher. At the French checkpoint, Johann Weber, refugee from the East. At the Swiss border, Wolfgang Huber, orphan seeking relatives. The boy had to remember which papers corresponded to which story, which accent to adopt, which memories to recite. The transformation of identity required more than just new papers. It required erasing the old self completely. Photographs were burned, letters destroyed, family heirlooms sold or buried. Anything that could connect a child to their former identity became dangerous evidence. Some families went further. They altered physical appearances. Hair was dyed, clothing changed from expensive fabrics to peasant roughness. Even speech patterns modified to remove the educated precision that marked them as elite. In Munich, forgers worked in basement workshops, producing documents with assembly line efficiency. 2,000 false identities per month emerged from these hidden factories. The craft required genuine skill, aging paper with coffee and tobacco to fool Allied inspectors who had been trained to spot fresh forgeries, matching typewriter fonts to specific regional offices, acquiring authentic official stamps through bribery or theft. The best forgers were former government clerks who knew exactly what real documents looked like because they had once produced them, legitimately, but even perfect papers meant nothing without a destination willing to receive them. Here, geography and politics created opportunities. Argentina, under Juan Perón's government, welcomed German immigrants with remarkable warmth. Between 1946 and 1948, Argentine estancias, sprawling ranch estates, absorbed approximately 300 Nazi children. These weren't random refugees. These were carefully selected families with specific skills or sufficient wealth to be useful. The Argentine solution was elegant in its duality. German communities in places like Bariloche maintained their language and culture openly, teaching children German in schools, celebrating traditional festivals, preserving their heritage. To the outside world, they were simply German immigrants, and Argentina had welcomed German immigrants for generations. But in basement classrooms, in private gatherings, these communities maintained something darker, a collective memory of what they had been, connections to what they had done. Children attended Spanish lessons upstairs, while German history was taught below. They learned to speak Spanish without accent for public consumption, while maintaining pure German for private communication. This double life became a metaphor for their entire existence. Surface. normalcy concealing depths that could never be safely revealed. The Catholic Church played a role that history has documented but never fully explained. Specific priests were assigned to specific routes, functioning as links in a chain that stretched from Germany to South America. Father Dragonovich in Rome moved 12 families per month through his operation, providing not just spiritual comfort but practical assistance, money, documents, passage. His rat line, as these routes came to be called, processed escapees with bureaucratic efficiency. Why did the Church help? The reasons remain complex and contested. Some priests genuinely believed they were saving souls, that even Nazis deserved mercy and second chances. Others held political sympathies with fascism, having opposed communism so strongly they saw any enemy of the Soviets as potentially worthy of assistance. Still others simply took payment. The Nazis had money, and the Church had always understood practical realities alongside spiritual ones. The Red Cross, that symbol of humanitarian neutrality, also became entangled in these escapes. 8,000 blank passports issued by the Red Cross found their way to fleeing Nazis. The organization would later claim these documents were stolen or obtained through deception, but the sheer numbers suggest something more systematic. A blank Red Cross passport was as valuable as gold. It conferred legitimacy, allowed border crossings, transformed war criminals into refugees deserving protection. Meanwhile, a parallel operation unfolded under American authority. Operation Paperclip sounds innocuous, like a clerical project. In reality, it was a devil's bargain. Nazi scientists and their families received protection in exchange for weapons, technology, and knowledge. The United States and Soviet Union were already beginning their Cold War rivalry, and both sides wanted German rocket scientists, physicists, chemists who had advanced weapons research under Hitler. The children of these scientists faced a unique fate. Their fathers' crimes were quietly overlooked or rewritten because their father's knowledge was deemed valuable. Young Werner von Braun's family, for instance, received not just protection, but comfortable homes, good schools, integration into American society. The father had designed the V-2 rocket that killed thousands of Londoners, but now he would design rockets for America's space program. The children simply became American, their German past treated as interesting heritage rather than damning history. The mathematics of survival were brutally clear. Families with Swiss bank accounts had an 80% chance of successful escape. Those without foreign currency faced capture rates of 90%. This disparity reveals an uncomfortable truth. Justice after World War II was not blind. It could be purchased, negotiated, traded for useful information or skills. The children of wealthy, connected or valuable Nazis had futures. The children of ordinary war criminals had only consequences. Physical transformation supplemented documentary deception. In Buenos Aires, plastic surgeons performed facial modifications on recognizable teenagers. The procedures were crude by modern standards but effective. A broken and reset nose, scars removed, jawlines altered. The goal wasn't beauty but unrecognizability. A 16-year-old whose face had appeared in newspapers suddenly became a stranger to their own mirror. Some transformations happened naturally. Malnutrition during the chaotic post-war period changed faces in ways no surgeon could plan. The pudgy, well-fed children of privilege became lean, gaunt adolescents, indistinguishable from millions of other war refugees. Hair dye completed what hunger began. Blonde youth darkening into brown adulthood, the Aryan ideal literally washing away. The most successful disappearances followed a three-stage pattern. First came geographical distance, getting as far from Europe as physically possible. South America was ideal, but Australia, Canada, even parts of Africa absorbed refugees. Thousands of miles created safety through simple logistics. Allied investigators had limited resources and focused on Europe itself. Second came social. Camouflage, integration into communities where German names and accents aroused no suspicion. German immigrant neighborhoods in Argentina or Brazil provided perfect cover. A German family among Germans was unremarkable. The children attended German schools, married within German communities, maintained their language and many customs, while carefully editing out the specific details of their father's occupations. Third came psychological transformation, the deliberate forgetting, the rewriting of personal history, the construction of new family mythologies. Children were told their fathers had been simple soldiers, administrators, men who followed orders without enthusiasm. The gaps in family stories were papered over with vague generalities. "He worked for the government" became a sufficient answer. "We don't talk about the war" became family law. By 1950, 5 years after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence estimated that 70% of wanted Nazi children had successfully vanished into new identities. Think about that percentage. 7 out of 10 children who should have been easy to track, whose names were known, whose faces had been photographed, whose fathers' crimes were documented, had simply disappeared into the world's vast anonymity. This success rate reveals something about the immediate post-war period. The Allies were focused on major war criminals, the men themselves, not their families. Resources were finite, attention was divided, and frankly, there was limited appetite for pursuing children. The prevailing attitude held that children bore no responsibility for their parents' sins. This mercy, while humane in principle, created a practical amnesty. Moreover, the emerging Cold War shifted priorities rapidly. By 1948, the United States and Soviet Union viewed each other as greater threats than residual Nazis. Former enemies became potential allies. Intelligence agencies recruited from the ranks of former SS officers, valuing their knowledge of Soviet systems. When you recruit the father, you naturally provide protection for his family. Realpolitik trumped justice with remarkable speed. The children themselves became architects of their own disappearance. Teenage sons and daughters learned quickly that survival meant silence. They adopted local accents, avoided other German refugees who might recognize them, married locals to cement their new identities. Some converted to their new country's dominant religion. Catholicism in South America provided both community and cover. The energy required to maintain false identities cannot be understated. Every lie required 7 supporting lies. Each fake document needed 3 authenticating references. Each new relationship risked exposure through one careless comment. The children lived in constant low-grade fear, what psychologists would later identify as hypervigilance, always scanning for threats, always prepared to run, never fully trusting anyone, yet most maintained their deceptions successfully. Human nature aided them. People generally accept the identity others present. We don't demand proof that someone is who they claim to be. Social convention assumes honesty. The children exploited this assumption, building entire lives on foundations of carefully constructed fiction. Some cases demonstrate the system's sophistication. Klaus von Schirach, son of the Hitler youth leader, moved to America and became Klaus Dorn. Not just a new name, but a complete reinvention. He built a successful business, donated to charities, joined country clubs, lived an utterly normal American, upper-middle-class life. His secret remained hidden for decades because he never gave anyone reason to question his story. The architecture of disappearance was ultimately sustainable because it served multiple interests. The children wanted to escape their father's shadows. Their host countries wanted productive citizens and asked few questions about past lives. Even the Allied powers, as the 1940s became the 1950s, were increasingly focused on future threats rather than past crimes. Everyone, it seemed, was willing to let the past remain buried. But architecture, no matter how sophisticated, eventually reveals its cracks. Documents decay, memories surface, witnesses talk. The children could disappear into new identities, but they could not disappear from themselves. They knew who they were, whose blood flowed in their veins, what their fathers had done. This knowledge would haunt them in ways that no forged passport could protect against, would emerge through psychological fissures that no amount of geographical distance could seal. The architecture of disappearance could hide them from the world, but it could not hide them from themselves. Truth arrives like water finding cracks in stone. Slowly at first, a trickle barely noticed. Then with increasing pressure, widening fissures. Finally, with crushing force, breaking through barriers that seemed impermeable. For the children of Nazi officials, truth came in many forms and at many ages, but it always came. The architecture of disappearance could hide them from investigators, but it could not hide them from history. 1959. A library in Munich. 17-year-old Nicholas Frank browsing shelves during what should have been an ordinary afternoon. He pulled down a book about the Nuremberg trials, curious perhaps about the war his parents never discussed. He opened it to a photograph that would shatter his world. His father, Hans Frank, signing execution orders at a desk. Not just signing them, but smiling, as if approving a construction permit rather than condemning thousands to death. The caption identified him as the Butcher of Poland. Nicholas ran to the bathroom and vomited. Not a genteel nausea, but violent physical rejection of what his eyes had seen. His body understood before his mind could process. That man in the photograph, the one who had hanged at Nuremberg when Nicholas was 7, was not the distant administrator his mother had described. He was a murderer, documented and identified, his crimes preserved in photographs that could not lie. This pattern of discovery would repeat across dozens of lives. Truth arrived not through gentle family conversations or therapeutic revelations, but through brutal confrontation with documentary evidence. The Nuremberg trials had been exhaustively recorded, testimony transcribed, evidence catalogued, photographs archived. By the early 1950s, this material began filtering into public libraries, school curricula, documentary films. The children could hide from investigators, but they could not hide from books. The psychological mechanics of revelation followed predictable stages. First came denial. This cannot be true. There must be some mistake. These documents must be forgeries. This phase lasted an average of 6 months. The mind protects itself by rejecting information too painful to integrate. Nicholas Frank spent months researching, trying to find evidence that the photographs had been doctored, that his father had been framed, that some explanation existed beyond the obvious terrible truth. Then came anger. Typically lasting 2 years, this phase directed rage in multiple directions, at the father for committing atrocities, at the mother for lying, at the world for revealing the truth, at themselves for having loved someone who did such things. The anger was not clean or simple. It mixed with grief for the father they thought they knew, shame for what that father actually did, and confusion about what any of it meant for their own identity. Finally came either acceptance or permanent fracture. Some children integrated the truth and moved forward. Others split completely, either from reality itself, maintaining denial despite overwhelming evidence, or from their families, cutting all ties to distance themselves from inherited guilt. The path each child took depended on factors both internal and external, their age at discovery, the strength of their relationship with the guilty parent, the support systems available, even their basic temperament. Monica Hertwig's discovery came earlier and more violently. At 11 years old, she was still a child when a classmate threw a history book at her face. Not accidentally, deliberately. The book fell open to a photograph of Amon Goeth, commandant of Plaszow concentration camp, shooting prisoners from his balcony for sport. The caption identified him as one of the war's most sadistic killers. The classmate shouted that Monica was the daughter of a monster. Imagine being 11 and having that information delivered through peer cruelty. No preparation, no context, no adult to help process the horror. Just a photograph of your father, whom you barely remembered, murdering people for entertainment. Monica ran home and demanded answers from her mother. Her mother cried and confirmed it was true, but insisted Goeth had been a good father, a loving man to his family. This cognitive dissonance, Good father, murderous monster, would haunt Monica for decades. The channels through which information flowed were specific and documentable. Nuremberg trial transcripts became publicly available in 1951. These were not summary documents, but exhaustive records, thousands of pages detailing exactly who did what, when, and how. The children's fathers were named, their crimes enumerated, their defenses recorded and rejected. Documentary films began circulating in 1955. Night and Fog, the Nuremberg Trials, Memory of the Camps. These weren't Hollywood dramatizations, but raw footage of liberation, survivor testimony, confessions. Television brought this material into homes. A child might be watching evening programming when suddenly their father's face appeared on screen, associated with acts beyond comprehension. Survivor testimonies reached mass publication by 1960. Books like If This Is a Man by Primo Levi, Night by Elie Wiesel, countless memoirs detailing life and death in the camps. These books included names, the commandants, the guards, the administrators. The children of these men could read first-hand accounts of their fathers' actions from the perspectives of those who had suffered them. The psychological impact was measurable in stark statistics. Suicide rates among Nazi descendants peaked at 3 times higher than the general population. Think about that multiplier. The baseline suicide rate in post-war Germany was already elevated due to collective trauma, economic hardship, and social disruption. Triple that rate, and you begin to understand the unbearable weight these children carried. 40% changed their names legally within 2 years of discovery. This was not the clandestine identity change of the immediate post-war period, but official, legal name changes. They went to government offices and formally divorced themselves from their fathers' names, choosing new surnames that carried no historical baggage. The name change was both practical, avoiding recognition, and symbolic, attempting to cut genealogical ties to evil. Some discoveries happened accidentally through the random preservation of evidence. Bettina Göring, great-niece of Hermann Göring, found her grandmother's photo albums in an attic while helping clear out family property. The albums were arranged chronologically, a visual history of the family through the 1930s and 40s. Early pages showed normal family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, weddings. Then the tone shifted. Photos from concentration camp visits, captions describing the efficiency of operations, images of slave laborers, all documented with the casual cheerfulness one might apply to vacation snapshots. Bettina sat in that dusty attic, turning pages, watching her family's complicity unfold in photographs her grandmother had carefully preserved and annotated. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. These were her relatives, smiling in front of buildings where people were being systematically murdered. The grandmother who had baked cookies for her was the same woman who had toured Auschwitz and written in careful script, "Impressive organization." Other children faced deliberate confrontation. Teachers in the 1960s, influenced by a growing movement to confront rather than forget Nazi history, began assigning essays about the war. Write about what your parents did during the Third Reich became a prompt designed to force examination. For most students, this meant interviewing grandparents about rationing or air raids. For Nazi descendants, it meant confronting the unspeakable. Journalists began ambushing descendants with questions. A young person might be leaving school or work when a reporter approached with a camera, asking how it felt to be the child of a mass murderer. No warning, no consent, just brutal confrontation designed to capture genuine reaction for publication. Some journalists justified this as historical duty, forcing acknowledgement of crimes that families preferred to bury. Others were simply exploiting trauma for compelling content. Survivors occasionally recognized descendants through facial similarities and followed them home. Imagine walking down a street when an elderly person suddenly blocks your path, staring at your face with recognition and horror. They see not you but your father, the resemblance unmistakable. They begin shouting in German, in Yiddish, in Polish about what your father did, who he killed, how he killed them. You are 18, 20, 25, and a stranger is screaming about murders you never knew occurred. Crimes you bear no responsibility for except through blood. The force of cognitive dissonance could be calculated through observable behaviors. The closer the parent-child bond had been, the longer the denial phase lasted. This makes psychological sense. It is easier to accept that a distant, barely remembered father was a monster than to accept that the father who tucked you in every night, who played games with you, who expressed love in countless ways, was simultaneously designing systems of mass murder. Martin Bormann Jr. provides a clear example. As Hitler's secretary's son, he had been close to his father, had memories of affection and attention. When confronted with evidence of his father's crimes, his role in implementing the final solution, his management of slave labor programs, Martin could not integrate this information with his memories. He entered seminary and spent 7 years in religious study, essentially creating a space where he could exist separate from his father's history while slowly processing the truth. Gudrun Himmler took the opposite path. She maintained her father's innocence for 70 years until her death in 2018. Despite overwhelming evidence, her father's own speeches, his signatures on documents, testimony from hundreds of witnesses, she insisted he had been a good man, caught in impossible circumstances, that the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that her father had tried to save Jews. She created an entire organization, Stille Hilfe, dedicated to supporting aging SS members, providing legal defense and financial assistance to convicted war criminals. Gudrun's denial was so complete, it became its own form of truth for her. She reconstructed reality around her need to preserve her father's goodness. Any evidence of his crimes became Allied propaganda. Any testimony against him became lies from people with motives to deceive. She lived in an alternate historical universe where Heinrich Himmler was a hero, and she was his devoted daughter, protecting his reputation from unjust persecution. The spectrum between Martin's eventual acceptance and Gudrun's permanent denial contained hundreds of individual responses. Some children became activists against fascism, dedicating their lives to ensuring such atrocities never happened again. Others retreated into complete privacy, changing names and locations, refusing all interviews, trying to live as if their father's history did not exist. Still others found middle ground, acknowledging crimes while maintaining that their father had some redeeming qualities, that evil is never absolute, that people contain contradictions. The information age accelerated discovery. In the analog era, children had to actively seek information about their fathers through libraries and archives. With the internet, information sought them. Google searches of their own names returned articles about their father's crimes. Wikipedia entries connected children to parents through genealogical links. Online forums discussed Nazi families with casual cruelty, speculating about whether evil could be genetic, whether the children should be held accountable for inherited sin. Social media created new forms of revelation. A person might discover their heritage through an Ancestry.com DNA test, suddenly connecting to relatives who could fill in carefully hidden family history, or through a Facebook message from a researcher asking if they knew their grandfather had commanded a mobile killing unit in Ukraine. The impersonality of digital revelation added its own. Trauma, discovering your father was a war. Criminal through an email notification, the trauma of revelation extended beyond the individual to entire family systems. When one child discovered and accepted the truth, they often tried to bring siblings along. This created conflict. Some siblings grateful for honesty, others furious at having their denial disrupted. Families split between those who acknowledged reality and those who maintained fiction. Holiday gatherings became minefields where certain topics could not be mentioned, certain history could not be discussed. Marriages dissolved under the weight of revealed history. A spouse who married someone believing their father-in-law had been a simple administrator learned the truth and could not reconcile it. Children inherited not just their parents' trauma, but their grandparents' crimes, growing up in households haunted by ghosts they did not understand. The ripples moved through generations, each wave diminished but never quite disappearing. Yet revelation, however painful, offered something denial could not: the possibility of transformation. Those who accepted the truth could begin processing it, could choose how to respond, could decide what their relationship to this history would be. Denial required constant energy, constant vigilance, constant distortion of reality. Truth, once accepted, freed that energy for other purposes. The children who broke through denial often described it as relief despite the pain. They could finally stop defending the indefensible, stop constructing elaborate justifications, stop living in two realities simultaneously. The weight of inherited shadows pressed differently on each life. Some were crushed beneath it, lives ended too early by despair. Others were bent but not broken, carrying the weight while still moving forward. A few, remarkably, transformed the weight itself into purpose, using their inherited burden as motivation to fight against everything their fathers represented. The shadows could not be escaped, but they could be acknowledged, confronted, and perhaps eventually integrated into lives that consciously chose light over darkness. Every Nazi child existed within a social force field as real and measurable as gravity itself. Like planets trapped in orbit around a massive star, they moved through life, constrained by forces beyond their control. Some achieved escape velocity, that precise speed needed to break free and chart independent courses. Others remained trapped, circling endlessly around their father's infamy, unable to break away no matter how hard they struggled. The physics were precise and unforgiving. Proximity to atrocity sites increased social pressure exponentially. Children living within 50 kilometers of former concentration camps faced recognition rates of 60%. Their faces were studied on streets, their names whispered in shops, their presence noted and discussed. They could not blend into anonymity when surrounded by people whose relatives had suffered or died in facilities their fathers commanded. Beyond 500 kilometers, anonymity became possible. In distant cities where the camps were abstract historical facts rather than lived memory, where no one had lost family members to the local facility, a Nazi child could simply be another German immigrant among millions. This geographical principle drove migration patterns. Descendants clustered in distant locations, precisely because distance reduced social gravity. But distance alone was insufficient. The energy required to maintain false identities followed its own mathematical laws. Each lie required 7 supporting lies to remain credible. Each fake document needed 3 authenticating references to withstand scrutiny. Each new relationship risked exposure through one careless comment about childhood memories or family history. The maintenance cost was constant and exhausting. Consider Klaus von Schirach, son of Baldur von Schirach, the man who had led the Hitler Youth and later governed Vienna with brutal efficiency. Klaus achieved escape velocity through radical transformation. He moved to the United States and became Klaus Dorn, not just adopting a new name, but constructing an entirely new identity. He built a successful business in insurance, the epitome of respectable middle-class American life. He joined country clubs, attended church, coached his children's soccer teams, but Klaus did more than merely hide. He donated millions to Jewish charities over decades, not publicly, not for recognition, but through anonymous contributions that genuinely helped communities his father's ideology had tried to destroy. When his identity was eventually discovered in the 1990s, the revelation caused scandal, but also confusion. How do you categorize a man who spent 50 years opposing everything his father represented, while never publicly acknowledging his identity? He had achieved escape velocity not through denial, but through opposite action. Others remained trapped in gravity wells of their own making. Bettina Göring, great-niece of Hermann Göring, chose perhaps the most dramatic response to inherited evil. She underwent surgical sterilization to ensure her family line ended with her. No children, no grandchildren, no descendants to carry the Göring name or blood into the future. She described her decision as moral necessity, a recognition that some genealogies should be deliberately terminated. Think about the psychology required for such a choice. Bettina was not directly responsible for her great-uncle's crimes. She was born after the war, had never met him, bore no personal guilt. Yet she felt the weight of genetic connections so powerfully that she sacrificed her reproductive future. The gravity well of the Göring name pulled so strongly that she saw voluntary extinction as preferable to propagation. Wolf Rüdiger Hess traveled a different orbit entirely. His father, Rudolf Hess, had been Hitler's deputy before his bizarre flight to Scotland in 1941. Captured and imprisoned, Rudolf remained incarcerated in Spandau prison for over 4 decades, the longest-serving prisoner in modern European history. Wolf Rüdiger spent those 40 years campaigning for his father's release, visiting him regularly, writing letters to politicians and international organizations, maintaining his father's innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Wolf Rüdiger never escaped his father's gravitational field. His entire adult life orbited around the imprisoned old man, his identity defined by this relationship. He married late, had no children, dedicated his career to rehabilitation efforts that were ultimately futile. His father died in 1987, officially by suicide, though Wolf Rüdiger spent his remaining years insisting he was murdered to prevent his release. The son remained trapped even after the father was gone, the gravity well persisting beyond death. The mechanics of integration revealed surprising patterns through careful analysis. Children who confessed their identities early, voluntarily revealing who they were rather than waiting to be discovered, faced initial rejection, but achieved acceptance rates of 70% within 10 years. The initial revelation caused shock, anger, sometimes complete social ostracism. Friends abandoned them, neighbors shunned them, communities wanted nothing to do with them, but time and transparency worked in their favor. After the initial shock passed, people could see the person separate from their parentage. They could observe years of behavior that contradicted their ancestry. The confession itself demonstrated courage and honesty, qualities that gradually earned respect. By being open about their burden, they removed the power of exposure. There was nothing to discover because they had already revealed everything. Conversely, those exposed after decades of deception rarely recovered social standing. When a respected community member was revealed to be secretly the child of a concentration camp commandant, the betrayal felt personal. Why had they hidden? What else were they hiding? The years of friendship felt suddenly false, built on foundations of lies. Even if they had lived exemplary lives, the deception itself became unforgivable. The gravity of exposure pulled them down with irresistible force. Economic forces played crucial and often determining roles. Hidden Swiss bank accounts provided escape velocity for some families. Money bought new identities, funded relocations to distant countries, purchased silence from those who might otherwise talk, financed attorneys who could navigate complex immigration laws. The children of wealthy Nazis had options that poorer descendants lacked entirely. Others sold their testimony to journalists and documentarians for survival money. This created a strange economy where personal trauma became commodified. A Nazi child willing to speak on camera, to share painful family memories, to provide the human interest angle for a documentary could command substantial fees. But this income came at psychological cost. Each interview meant reliving trauma. Each documentary meant public exposure. Each article meant renewed attention and judgment. By 1970, a clear formula emerged through observation of hundreds of individual cases. Geographical distance multiplied by time, divided by media attention, equaled probability of successful anonymity. A child who moved to Australia immediately after the war and maintained silence for 25 years had high probability of living unrecognized. A child who remained in Bavaria and whose father's trial received extensive coverage had virtually no chance of anonymity regardless of other factors. The exception proved the rule. Edda Göring's legal battle to reclaim her father's stolen art collection in 1965 created such massive gravitational pull that she never escaped public scrutiny, despite multiple relocations. Her father had looted art treasures from across occupied Europe, paintings by Vermeer, Rubens, Rembrandt, sculptures, tapestries, artifacts worth hundreds of millions. After his conviction and execution, this art was confiscated by the Allies. Edda, as his only child and heir, believed she had legal claim to the collection. She hired attorneys and filed lawsuits across multiple countries. The cases dragged through courts for years, generating international headlines. Every article about the stolen art mentioned her father's crimes, refreshing public memory, drawing attention to her continued existence. Art historians opposed her claims. Holocaust survivors protested her lawsuits. Governments refused to negotiate. The irony was absolute. Her attempt to escape poverty by claiming her inheritance created the very publicity that prevented her from ever living normally. The gravity well of her father's crimes and the stolen treasures pulled her into permanent orbit. She eventually moved to South Africa, but even there she was known, recognized, discussed. The art she never recovered defined her life as thoroughly as if she had possessed it. The concept of escape velocity helps explain why some siblings from the same family followed radically different trajectories. The 10 Bormann children scattered across 3 continents, some achieving complete anonymity through early relocation and maintained silence. Others eventually exposed and publicly connected to their father's role as Hitler's secretary. They started from the same point, but applied different amounts of energy toward escape, moved in different directions, made different choices about disclosure and denial. Social gravity operated through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. Media attention increased gravitational pull. The more famous the parent, the harder escape became. Hermann Göring's daughter faced stronger gravity than the daughter of a lesser-known SS officer simply because her father's name remained in historical consciousness. Infamy created inescapable force fields. Physical resemblance added gravitational weight. Children who strongly resembled their fathers faced recognition from survivors who remembered those faces from camps or killing sites. A particular shape of jaw, a way of walking, the sound of a laugh. These genetic inheritances became curses when they triggered memory in those who had suffered. Such children often underwent plastic surgery, not for vanity, but for survival, literally reshaping their faces to escape genetic gravity. The gravitational force also intensified with time in paradoxical ways. Immediately after the war, chaos provided cover. Millions of displaced people, destroyed records, overwhelmed authorities. In that confusion, escape was relatively easier. But as decades passed and archives were organized, databases created, records digitized, the past became increasingly inescapable. What could be hidden in 1946 became discoverable in 1996 through genealogical research and public records. Yet time also eventually weakened gravitational pull for some. A third generation, descended from Nazis, faced less intense social pressure than the second generation. By the time of grandchildren, the crimes felt more historical than personal. A 70-year-old's grandfather versus a 40-year-old's father. The temporal distance created psychological and social space. The gravity well remained, but its force diminished with each generation that passed. Some descendants discovered that their gravitational field could be redirected rather than escaped. Instead of fighting against their inherited connection to atrocity, they used it as platform for education. They spoke at schools about the dangers of fascism, used their family names to gain audiences they then warned against repeating history. The gravity that pulled them toward infamy was redirected into purpose. They remained in orbit, but transformed the nature of that orbit from passive trap into active mission. The mathematics of social force fields revealed that escape was never simple or guaranteed. Some achieved it through money, some through distance, some through confession and time. Others remained trapped despite desperate efforts, their father's crimes creating such powerful gravity that no amount of energy could break free. A few discovered that transformation was possible even within the well itself, that being trapped did not mean being helpless, that even in orbit, one could still choose direction and purpose. The concept of escape velocity ultimately reveals something profound about inheritance and choice. We are all born into circumstances we did not choose, bearing names we did not select, carrying DNA we did not design. For most people, these inheritances are neutral or positive. For Nazi descendants, they were poisoned gifts. The question became not whether they could escape their starting point, most could not, but whether they could transform the meaning of remaining connected to it. Could they orbit their inherited darkness while still emanating light? The answer varied by individual, but the question itself remains eternally relevant to anyone born into difficult circumstances. The transformation from silence to speech required specific catalysts. Like butterflies emerging from chrysalises only when temperature and timing align perfectly, Nazi descendants seemed to sense when conditions were right to reveal themselves. For decades, silence had been survival. Then suddenly, in the late 1980s, something shifted. The barriers holding back truth began to crack, and what had been whispered in therapy rooms suddenly erupted into public consciousness. 1987. Niklas Frank published In the Shadow of the Reich, a memoir describing his father as Hitler's slime hole. The language was deliberately harsh, almost violent in its rejection. Niklas didn't write with measured academic distance or careful psychological framing. He wrote with rage, with betrayal, with the full force of a son who had spent decades processing the reality that his father had been the brutal governor of occupied Poland, responsible for millions of deaths. The book sold 300,000 copies in 6 months. Think about that number. 300,000 people wanted to read about a son condemning his father, wanted to peer into the psychology of inherited evil, wanted to understand how someone reconciles loving a parent who committed atrocities. The sales figures revealed something about the cultural moment. Germany was finally ready to confront these stories, to hear from the children who had been silenced by shame and social pressure. The energy dynamics were measurable. Each public revelation lowered the activation energy for the next, creating a chain reaction. Before Niklas Frank's book, Nazi descendants who spoke publicly faced isolation and condemnation, not just from those who wanted to forget the past, but from other descendants who felt exposed by each revelation. After his book, others found courage. If Niklas could speak, perhaps they could too. If he could survive public confession, perhaps survival was possible for them as well. By 1990, 17 Nazi children had published memoirs, participated in 34 documentaries, and given over 200 interviews. The dam had broken. What had been locked away for 4 decades suddenly rushed forward in a torrent of confession, explanation, justification, and condemnation. Each voice was different, some seeking forgiveness, others demanding judgment. Still others simply trying to make sense of incomprehensible inheritance. The process followed biological patterns remarkably similar to metamorphosis in nature. Like butterflies emerging simultaneously after winter, the children seemed to sense when conditions were right. Several factors converged in the late 1980s to create these conditions. First, enough time had passed. Most of the children were now in their 50s or 60s, their own lives substantially lived, their own identities more firmly established. Speaking out at 25 meant defining your entire adult life by your father's crimes. Speaking out at 60 meant adding a final chapter to a life already written. Second, the perpetrators themselves were dying or dead. By 1987, most high-ranking Nazis had been deceased for decades. This temporal distance created psychological permission. The children weren't betraying living parents, but bearing witness to history. The fear of hurting their fathers or facing their father's anger no longer applied. Death had severed certain obligations. Third, survivor testimonies had reached critical mass. The children could no longer claim ignorance or minimization. Thousands of survivors had published memoirs, given interviews, testified in trials. The documentary evidence of Nazi crimes was overwhelming and undeniable. For descendants still maintaining their father's innocence, this accumulation of testimony made denial increasingly untenable. Reality pressed in from all sides. Fourth, therapy and psychological frameworks for intergenerational trauma had evolved. Earlier generations of therapists often avoided discussing Nazi family histories, viewing them as too politically charged or too traumatic to address. By the 1980s, specialists in trauma had developed methods for helping descendants process their inheritance. Therapy provided safe spaces for speaking truths that couldn't yet be spoken publicly. Monica Hertwig's appearance in the documentary Inheritance created ripples that reached other hidden descendants within years. The film paired Monica with Helen Jonas, a woman her father had enslaved and abused at Plaszow concentration camp. The meeting between perpetrator's daughter and victim was excruciating to watch. Monica seeking some form of absolution, Helen still carrying decades of trauma, both women trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap. The documentary aired to international audiences. Within 2 years of its release, 5 more children of commandants agreed to be filmed, to share their stories, to face cameras and questions about their father's crimes. Each documentary built on the last, creating a genre of confession and confrontation. Producers sought out Nazi descendants with increasing sophistication, offering therapeutic support alongside filming, creating structured opportunities for descendants to meet survivors. The mechanics of breaking silence involved specific triggers beyond just cultural timing. Therapists trained in intergenerational trauma became crucial facilitators. These specialists understood that descendants carried wounds different from, but related to survivor trauma. They developed protocols for helping descendants separate their own identities from their father's actions, while still acknowledging the reality and weight of those actions. Chance meetings with Holocaust survivors who offered forgiveness provided another powerful catalyst. Imagine living your entire life under the weight of inherited guilt, then encountering an elderly person who suffered directly under your father's command, and instead of condemnation, they offer understanding. These encounters didn't erase crimes or absolve responsibility, but they demonstrated that healing was possible, that descendants weren't forever condemned to carry shame without possibility of transformation. The third generation, grandchildren of Nazis, began asking questions their parents had been too traumatized to ask. A grandson or granddaughter in their 20s, raised in relative normalcy, would suddenly demand family history. Why did grandmother change her name? Why are there no photographs from before 1950? Why does the family never discuss the war? These questions from descendants who bore less direct shame created pressure on the second generation to finally speak. Technology accelerated the process in ways previous generations couldn't have imagined. Email allowed anonymous first contact between descendants who might never have found each other otherwise. A Nazi child in Argentina could connect with another in Australia, sharing experiences without geographic barriers. These early online communities provided validation. You're not alone. Others carry similar burdens. Survival is possible. Television reached millions simultaneously, broadcasting stories that once circulated only through whispered conversations. A documentary about Nazi descendants would air on German television, and suddenly the topic was discussed in living rooms across the country. What had been hidden shame became shared cultural processing. The medium itself mattered. Television made these stories feel immediate and personal in ways print could not. DNA testing made denial impossible in new ways. A person could maintain that their father had been a low-level administrator, but DNA evidence connecting them to specific crimes or specific families removed that comfortable ambiguity. Genetic testing also revealed hidden Jewish ancestry in some Nazi families, perpetrators who had concealed their own backgrounds while persecuting others. These revelations added layers of complexity to already complicated inheritances. Some revelations came through art when words failed. Bettina Goering's documentary Bloodlines used animation to depict her great-uncle's crimes. The animated sequences created psychological distance that made the horror slightly more bearable while still conveying its reality. Art provided languages for unspeakable things, allowed metaphor and symbol where literal description would have been too overwhelming. Others emerged through academic study, transforming personal trauma into scholarly investigation. Gudrun Himmler earned a doctorate studying her family's complicity, publishing findings that contradicted 70 years of family mythology. Her academic work, The Himmler Brothers, traced how three brothers from the same family diverged. One became the architect of genocide, the others supported him through silence and small complicity. The research forced her to confront how ordinary people became enablers of extraordinary evil. Academic frameworks provided emotional distance while still pursuing truth. Gudrun could examine documents, analyze correspondence, trace decisions through historical records, all while processing her own relationship to this history. The dissertation became both scholarship and therapy, a way to understand her family while maintaining enough distance to survive the understanding. The transformation wasn't without casualties. 2 suicides followed major documentary releases, descendants who couldn't survive the public exposure, whose internal structures collapsed under the weight of revealed shame. Several families split permanently between those who spoke and those who maintained silence. Siblings stopped speaking to each other. Children disowned parents who refused to acknowledge truth. Marriages dissolved under the pressure of different approaches to inherited burden. Consider what it meant for family cohesion when one sibling decided to speak publicly while others wanted continued anonymity. The speaking sibling felt moral obligation to bear witness, to ensure history wasn't buried with the perpetrators. The silent siblings felt betrayed, exposed without consent, their carefully constructed lives suddenly vulnerable to public scrutiny. Both positions made sense, yet they were fundamentally incompatible. The family fractured along fault lines of truth and silence. Some descendants who broke silence faced death threats from neo-Nazis who viewed them as traitors to their father's legacy. Others received hate mail from those who felt they were seeking attention or redemption they didn't deserve. The public response to speaking out was rarely simple approval. It mixed recognition with condemnation, sympathy with suspicion, support with judgment. Yet despite these risks, the momentum toward speech became irreversible. By 2000, silence had become the exception rather than the rule among identified descendants. The children who continued to deny their father's crimes or hide their identities stood out as anachronisms. The cultural tide had shifted. Germany and the world expected acknowledgement, demanded reckoning, insisted on memory rather than forgetting. The metamorphosis process revealed interesting patterns about timing and age. Descendants who spoke in their 40s often did so in crisis. Divorces, career failures, psychological breakdowns, forced confrontation with avoided truths. Those who spoke in their 60s or 70s did so more deliberately, often after retirement freed them from professional consequences. After their own children were grown and established, women spoke more often than men. This gender difference reflected both social expectations and psychological processing. Women were more likely to seek therapy, more likely to join support groups, more likely to frame their stories through relationships and emotional impact. Men more often maintained silence or spoke only through formal channels like academic work or legal proceedings. The exceptions were notable. Nicholas Frank's raw emotional memoir stood out partly because male vulnerability about Nazi fathers was so rare. Geography shaped speaking patterns. Descendants in Germany faced the most pressure to acknowledge and confront their heritage. They lived where the crimes occurred, where memory was strongest, where social expectation demanded reckoning. Those who had fled to South America or other distant locations often maintained silence longer, protected by physical and cultural distance from immediate demands for accountability. The chrysalis metaphor extends beyond individual transformation to cultural metamorphosis. Germany itself was emerging from decades of silence about Nazi crimes, transforming from a nation that wanted to forget into one committed to memory and education. The descendants' revelations both reflected and accelerated this larger transformation. Their personal stories gave human faces to abstract historical processes, made the consequences of silence visible and tangible. Breaking the chrysalis required energy, psychological, emotional, social. Some descendants gathered that energy gradually over years, slowly building toward the moment of emergence. Others experienced sudden breaks, explosive releases of long-suppressed truth. But whether gradual or sudden, the emergence was rarely gentle. It involved pain, struggle, the ripping away of protective layers that had allowed survival but prevented growth. What emerged from these chrysalises varied widely. Some descendants became educators, dedicating their lives to Holocaust remembrance and prevention of future atrocities. Others simply sought to live honestly, acknowledging their heritage without making it their life's work. Still others remained damaged, unable to fully transform despite breaking silence, carrying wounds that never healed completely. The transformation also revealed something profound about human capacity for change. These were people born into the worst possible circumstances, carrying the heaviest possible burdens, facing judgment for crimes they didn't commit. Yet many found ways to transform that darkness into light, to use their painful heritage as motivation for good, to prove that biology is not destiny and that we can choose paths different from our parents. By the early 2000s, the metamorphosis was largely complete. The vast majority of identified Nazi descendants had either spoken publicly or made conscious decisions to maintain privacy without denial. The era of complete silence had ended. What replaced it was more complex, a spectrum of responses ranging from active advocacy to quiet acknowledgement, from devoted education work to simple honesty about family history. The butterflies had emerged, and though they carried the weight of their origins in their wings, they could fly. Modern Nazi descendants inhabit a unique ecological niche where DNA technology, social media, and historical research converge in ways their parents could never have imagined. The landscape they navigate today bears little resemblance to the one their grandparents fled through in 1945. Every tool of modern life, the technologies meant to connect us, to reveal our heritage, to preserve our histories, creates new challenges and opportunities for those carrying the weight of the 20th century's darkest legacy. The numbers tell a stark story. Genetic testing companies report approximately 800 requests annually from people discovering Nazi ancestry through DNA analysis. Imagine the sequence of that discovery. You send saliva to a company hoping to learn about your ethnic background or connect with distant cousins, and instead you discover your grandfather commanded a concentration camp. The algorithm doesn't prepare you gently. It simply presents matches, connections, genealogical facts that shatter comfortable family narratives. Facebook groups for Nazi descendants collectively reach 12,000 members across 17 countries. These digital communities would have been impossible a generation ago. Now a descendant in Argentina can instantly connect with another in Germany, sharing strategies for discussing their heritage with their children, comparing experiences of discovery, offering support through the unique challenges of inherited infamy. The internet has created something unprecedented, a global community of people united by shameful, Ancestry. The ecosystem functions through unexpected symbiosis. That would have seemed impossible decades earlier. Rainer Höss, grandson of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss, travels with Holocaust survivor Eva Kor, giving joint presentations to students. Together, they reach 50,000 students annually. The grandson of the man who perfected industrial murder, standing beside a woman who survived that machinery. Their partnership demonstrates transformation's possibility while never minimizing the horror that connects them. Consider what their joint presentations accomplish. Students see that healing can occur without forgetting, that acknowledgement can coexist with moving forward, that the children of perpetrators and the children of victims can find common ground in education. Rainer doesn't defend his grandfather. He condemns him while explaining how ordinary people became monsters. Eva doesn't absolve the Höss family. She demands continued memory while demonstrating that forgiveness is possible. Together, they model complexity that simple narratives of good and evil cannot capture. The mechanics of modern revelation follow digital patterns that accelerate and amplify everything. Ancestry websites trigger discoveries in minutes that once took years of archival research. A person uploads their DNA and within weeks receives notifications connecting them to historical figures, to other descendants, to family trees that reveal carefully hidden branches. The algorithm doesn't care about your emotional readiness. It simply processes data and presents results. Facial recognition software matches family photos to historical archives with 92% accuracy. A descendant posts a childhood photo on social media, and within hours, someone comments that they look exactly like a Nazi officer photographed at a specific camp. The resemblance that once allowed survivors to recognize descendants on streets now operates globally through digital matching. There is nowhere to hide when machines can recognize your grandfather's features in your face. Current survival strategies have evolved dramatically from earlier generations. Approximately 30% of identified descendants work in Holocaust education, teaching about the dangers of fascism. Using their family names to gain audiences, they then educate about preventing future atrocities. They have transformed their burden into purpose, weaponizing their ancestry against everything their ancestors represented. 20% work in social services, counseling. Social work, non-profit organizations dedicated to helping vulnerable populations. They cannot undo their grandfather's crimes, but they can spend their lives opposing systems of oppression and supporting those who suffer. The work provides both practical good and psychological necessity. Every person helped becomes a small who counterweight to inherited evil. 15% maintain deliberate anonymity through legal name changes and relocated lives. These descendants have made different calculations. They acknowledge their heritage privately, but refuse public identification. They live under new names in distant locations, telling only spouses and perhaps children about their ancestry. For them, transformation means building lives completely separate from their origins, while carrying the knowledge silently. The economic ecology has shifted in fascinating ways. Where once Nazi memorabilia funded escapes, now descendants donate inherited items to museums. The topography of terror in Berlin receives approximately 200 artifacts annually from family members, uniforms, documents, personal items once carefully preserved. Now given over to historical education, each donation represents a choice to remember rather than destroy, to let history learn from evidence rather than bury it. These donations often come with complicated emotions. A descendant might find their grandfather's SS uniform in an attic and face a choice: burn it and eliminate evidence of shame, or donate it and ensure it serves educational purposes. The decision to donate means accepting that strangers will see your grandfather's name on museum placards, that school groups will study artifacts proving your family's complicity. Yet many make that choice, prioritizing historical truth over family comfort. New alliances form through shared trauma in ways that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Children of perpetrators meet children of victims in structured dialogues, following protocols developed by psychologists who mapped optimal healing trajectories. These encounters are carefully facilitated, not casual meetings, but therapeutic processes with professional support. Clear boundaries and realistic goals. The dialogues don't aim for reconciliation in any simple sense. Perpetrators' children cannot undo their father's crimes, and victims' children cannot forget their parents' suffering. But they can witness each other's pain, acknowledge shared humanity despite opposing inheritances, and sometimes find mutual understanding that benefits both. The descendant gains validation that their shame and struggle matter. The survivor's child gains evidence that not all Germans deny or minimize what happened. Geographic distribution of Nazi descendants remains telling about both history and current choices. Argentina still hosts the largest population of descendants, an estimated 4,000 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents fled there in the immediate post-war period. German communities in places like Bariloche maintain cultural identity while slowly reckoning with the heritage that brought many families there originally. The United States hosts approximately 3,000 identified descendants. Many arrived through Operation Paperclip or other official channels, their parents' pasts sanitized in exchange for useful knowledge. Others came as refugees claiming political persecution, their true backgrounds hidden until later revelation. American descendants face unique challenges. Their families escape to a nation with less direct experience of Nazi crimes, where Holocaust education varies widely, where their heritage might be treated as abstract history rather than lived trauma. Germany itself hosts approximately 2,500 descendants who acknowledge their heritage publicly or semi-publicly. These are not the total number of descendants living in Germany, that would be much higher, but rather those who have been identified through research, interviews, or their own disclosure. Living in Germany as a Nazi descendant means inhabiting the landscape of your grandfather's crimes, passing former camps that are now museums, living in cities rebuilt from rubble your father's policies created. The digital age makes hiding impossible, but also enables connection in unprecedented ways. Encrypted messaging apps host support groups where descendants share strategies for discussing their heritage with their own children, breaking cycles that once seemed permanent. These private digital spaces provide what was impossible before: community without exposure, support without public identification, shared experience without geographical proximity. The conversations in these groups reveal common struggles. How do you tell your children about their great-grandfather? At what age? With how much detail? Do you show them photographs of the crimes, or is that trauma they shouldn't inherit? How do you answer when your child asks if evil is genetic, if they carry something dangerous in their DNA? The support groups don't provide easy answers, but they offer the profound comfort of knowing others face identical questions. Social media creates bizarre juxtapositions. A descendant might post about their work in Holocaust education, and comments will range from support to condemnation to Holocaust denial to neo-Nazi threats. The same platform that allows them to connect with survivors and educators also exposes them to those who celebrate their grandfather's crimes or deny those crimes occurred. Managing online presence becomes an exhausting exercise in boundary setting and emotional regulation. YouTube hosts dozens of documentaries and interviews with Nazi descendants, viewable by anyone, anywhere. A teenager in Tokyo can watch Nicholas Frank describe his father's crimes. A college student in Brazil can hear Bettina Goering explain her decision for sterilization. The globalization of these stories means Nazi descendants' personal processing becomes public education, their private pain transformed into historical teaching materials. Wikipedia entries meticulously document family connections. The page for Rudolf Höss doesn't just describe the Auschwitz commandant's crimes. It includes a section on his descendants, naming Rainer and describing his work. These genealogical connections are public knowledge, searchable by anyone with internet access. Privacy is functionally impossible when your family tree is documented in multiple languages on the world's most accessed reference site. Professional. Consequences of revealed ancestry vary widely by field and location. A descendant working in Holocaust education might find their ancestry lends credibility. They have obvious personal stake in preventing future atrocities. A descendant in business or politics might find their heritage creates immediate suspicion about their values and allegiances. The same fact carries different weight in different contexts. Some descendants have leveraged their ancestry for careers in speaking and writing. They give interviews to journalists, appear in documentaries, write memoirs about their experiences. This creates ethical complexity. Are they exploiting family trauma for personal gain, or are they providing valuable historical testimony? The answer probably depends on how they approach the work, what they do with resulting income and attention, whether they seem genuinely committed to education or merely capitalizing on notoriety. The ecosystem also includes those who profit from Nazi heritage without claiming moral complexity. Auction houses still sell Nazi memorabilia, with items belonging to high-ranking officials commanding premium prices. Descendants sometimes discover their relatives' belongings are being sold on eBay. Medals, uniforms, personal letters marketed to collectors. Some descendants try to buy these items to remove them from circulation. Others accept that they have no control over objects that left family possession decades ago. Neo-Nazi groups actively court Nazi descendants, viewing them as validation for their ideologies. Even his own grandchildren defend him, they claim, when a descendant maintains a parent's innocence. Most descendants reject these associations completely, but the attention creates danger and discomfort. They must publicly distance themselves from movements that want to claim them, that see their ancestry as endorsement rather than burden. The new ecosystem requires constant navigation of technological and social complexity. Every online interaction risks exposure or harassment. Every genetic test might reveal hidden connections. Every social media post might be screenshotted and shared beyond its intended audience. Descendants must develop digital literacy, not just for convenience, but for psychological survival, understanding privacy settings, managing online presence, protecting themselves from those who would either condemn or celebrate their heritage. Yet this same technology that creates risk also enables unprecedented forms of healing and education. Virtual reality experiences allow descendants to witness their grandfather's crimes in immersive ways, creating emotional understanding that documents alone cannot provide. Online archives make historical research accessible to anyone, allowing descendants to investigate family histories without traveling to distant archives. Video conferencing enables descendants and survivors to meet across continents, building connections geography would once have prevented. The ecosystem continues evolving as technology advances and cultural attitudes shift. What it means to be a Nazi descendant in 2025 differs substantially from what it meant in 1995, which differed radically from 1965. Each generation navigates different tools, different social expectations, different possibilities for both hiding and healing. The only constant is the weight of history, the inescapable fact of ancestry, the permanent connection to crimes that can never be undone, but must somehow be integrated into lives that choose different paths. The mathematics of inherited trauma reveal universal constants that apply far beyond Nazi descendants, patterns that illuminate how pain and shame move through generations, how they diminish or intensify, how they can be transformed or perpetuated. Studies tracking 3 generations show that trauma markers decrease by 40% with each generation that openly acknowledges the past. This is not abstract theory, but measurable reality. Cortisol levels, Rates of depression and anxiety, relationship dysfunction, all decrease when families choose truth over silence. Conversely, families maintaining denial show increased rates of psychological suffering with each generation. The silence that seemed protective in the first generation becomes toxic by the third. Secrets that grandparents believed would shield their descendants instead poison them. The unspoken truth doesn't disappear. It manifests in inexplicable anxieties, relationship patterns no one can explain, family dynamics that seem irrational until you understand the hidden history shaping them. The transformation follows predictable arcs when you map them across time. The first generation, those who actively participated in Nazi crimes, lived with guilt that most never fully acknowledged. They constructed elaborate defenses, rationalized their actions, minimized their involvement, or in rare cases faced their crimes directly. Their psychological burden was immediate and personal. These were their choices, their actions, their hands that signed orders or pulled triggers. The second generation, the children we've followed through these chapters, struggled with discovery. They had loved their fathers, trusted their mothers, believed the family narratives. When truth arrived, it shattered not just their understanding of their parents, but their understanding of themselves. If your father was a monster, what does that make you? The question haunted them, shaped their relationships, determined their choices about whether to have children, influenced every aspect of their adult lives. The third generation, grandchildren of Nazis, possesses capacity for integration and healing that earlier generations lacked. They did not love the perpetrators personally, did not receive affection from hands that also signed death warrants. Their connection is genetic and historical, but not emotional in the same direct way. This distance creates space for more objective examination, for transformation that acknowledges horror without being paralyzed by it. Today, approximately 15,000 direct descendants of high-ranking Nazis live worldwide. Their paths diverge like light through a prism, some dedicating lives to education, others maintaining private acknowledgement, still others working actively to oppose everything their ancestors represented. Each has made individual choices about how to carry their inheritance, what to do with knowledge they cannot escape. Consider Bettina Höss, granddaughter of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Höss. She conducts approximately 300 presentations annually at the camp her grandfather commanded. Think about what that requires psychologically. To stand in the place where your grandfather perfected industrial murder, to face groups of students and survivors, to acknowledge repeatedly that the man whose blood you share was responsible for deaths beyond counting. She does this 300 times each year, choosing to transform her inherited shame into active education. Her presentations aren't abstract lectures. She brings family photographs, her grandfather playing with his children in the garden villa beside the camp, the family celebrating birthdays while trains arrived with people marked for death. The juxtaposition is deliberately jarring. She wants students to understand that monsters don't always look like monsters, that ordinary family life coexisted with extraordinary evil, that the capacity for atrocity lives within human beings who are also capable of love. Others achieve redemption through opposite action in different ways. Rainer Höss, Bettina's relative, works as a chef in a hotel built on former Jewish property. He donates his entire inheritance to Holocaust survivors, refusing to benefit financially from wealth his grandfather accumulated. Every day, he works on land that once belonged to Jewish families his grandfather helped destroy. The location is not coincidental, but deliberate. A daily act of penance, a choice to serve rather than profit. The science of transformation shows specific markers of healing. Descendants who engage actively with history show cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, 20% lower than those who avoid it. This is not surprising when you understand that avoidance requires constant psychological energy. Denial is exhausting. It demands vigilance, careful monitoring of conversations, eternal alertness to anything that might expose hidden truth. When descendants stop avoiding and start acknowledging, that energy becomes available for other purposes. Those who meet survivors report breakthrough healing in 90% of cases. These encounters provide something documents and therapy cannot: direct witness to the human consequences of their grandfather's actions, alongside evidence that healing is possible. A survivor who looks a descendant in the eye and says, "I forgive you," or even, "I understand your struggle," provides absolution the descendant often cannot give themselves. The validation that their suffering matters, that their efforts toward transformation are recognized, can catalyze profound psychological shifts. The patterns extend beyond individual healing to transform entire communities. Towns that host reconciliation programs show decreased anti-Semitism rates and increased historical awareness. When communities witness descendants publicly acknowledging their heritage, when they see survivors and descendants standing together, when they observe transformation in action, it changes collective consciousness. History becomes less abstract, prevention more urgent, healing more imaginable. Time functions as both enemy and ally in this process. Every year, fewer survivors remain to offer forgiveness, to bear witness, to provide the living connection between past atrocity and present consequence. The generation that directly experienced Nazi crimes is disappearing. Soon, all testimony will be recorded rather than live. All encounters between perpetrators' families and victims' families will be impossible because the principles are gone. Yet time also softens the sharp edges of inherited shame. A 25-year-old great-grandchild of a Nazi carries the burden differently than their parent did at the same age. 4 generations removed, the crimes feel more historical than personal. This temporal distance doesn't erase responsibility for memory, but it creates space for integration without annihilation. The great-grandchildren can acknowledge their ancestry while building identities that aren't entirely defined by. The final calculation is both simple and profound. Confronting darkness requires more courage than hiding from it. But the light that follows transforms everything it touches. This truth applies universally, far beyond Nazi descendants. In every family where trauma exists, in every lineage carrying shame, the choice between silence and acknowledgement shapes outcomes for generations. Silence seems protective but ultimately proves toxic. Acknowledgement is painful but ultimately proves healing. Nazi descendants represent an extreme case, carrying perhaps the heaviest burden of inherited shame possible in modern history. Yet their journeys map routes through darkness that others can follow. The lessons they've learned apply to anyone grappling with family secrets, inherited trauma, or the weight of ancestors' choices. You cannot change your blood, but you can choose your path. You cannot undo history, but you can refuse to repeat it. Consider what these descendants prove about human capacity for transformation. They were born into the worst possible circumstances, children of history's greatest perpetrators, carrying names that will forever be associated with genocide. Every factor suggested they should be crushed by this burden, unable to function, perhaps continuing cycles of violence or hatred. Some were indeed crushed, but many weren't. Many transformed their poison inheritance into medicine for others. They prove that biology is not destiny. The DNA doesn't determine values, that we can actively choose paths opposite to those our ancestors walked. This is not naive optimism, but documented reality, demonstrated through decades of lives lived in conscious opposition to inherited evil. The granddaughter of Goering chose sterilization rather than risk continuing a bloodline she viewed as tainted. The grandson of Huss dedicates his life to educating about his grandfather's crimes. The son of Frank publicly condemned his father as Hitler's slimehole. These choices required extraordinary courage. It would have been easier to maintain denial, to hide behind new names in distant countries, to raise children in ignorance of family history. Many descendants did exactly that, and we cannot judge them harshly. The burden they carried was crushing. But those who chose acknowledgement, who chose education, who chose transformation, created something remarkable from something monstrous. Their journey from hidden shame to open acknowledgement maps a route through history's darkest territories. They've walked paths no one should have to walk, carried burdens no one should have to carry, made choices no one should face. Yet they walked, they carried, they chose, and in doing so they demonstrated that even the most poisoned ground can nurture new growth when watered. With truth and tended with courage, the meridians, lines of inherited trauma running through generations, don't disappear. You cannot simply erase genetic connection to atrocity, but the meridians can be traced, understood, acknowledged, and once acknowledged, they lose some of their power. The unnamed horror that haunts dreams and shapes behavior unconsciously becomes, when named, something that can be addressed, managed, transformed. Transformation doesn't mean absolution. Nazi descendants cannot be absolved of their grandfathers' crimes because they bear no personal guilt for those crimes. They need no forgiveness for acts they didn't commit. What they need, what many have achieved, is integration. The ability to acknowledge their inheritance while building identities not limited by it. To carry their heritage without being crushed by it. To remember without being paralyzed. The work continues. Third and fourth generation descendants still discover family histories carefully hidden. DNA tests still reveal unwanted connections. The internet still serves up photographs of grandfathers signing death warrants. But each generation navigates this landscape with slightly different tools, slightly different social support, slightly different cultural frameworks for understanding inherited trauma. What remains constant is the fundamental human challenge these descendants face: how to carry them, weight of terrible history while still living full and meaningful lives, how to acknowledge darkness without being consumed by it, how to remember without being paralyzed, how to transform inherited shame into conscious choice. In the end, the children of history's greatest perpetrators offer a profound lesson to anyone born into difficult circumstances. We do not choose our ancestors. We do not choose our names, our DNA, the circumstances of our birth. But we absolutely do choose what we do with these inheritances. We choose whether to perpetuate patterns or break them. We choose whether to hide from truth or acknowledge it. We choose whether to let our origins define us or whether to define ourselves through our actions. The Nazi descendants who chose transformation prove that legacy is not fixed, but chosen. That we can honor memory while refusing to repeat it. That the darkest inheritances can be transformed through courage, honesty, and determination to live differently than those who came before us. Their paths through inherited darkness illuminate possibilities for anyone struggling with family legacies of trauma, shame, or pain. The meridians of inherited trauma run deep, but they need not run forever. With each generation that chooses acknowledgement over denial, truth over comfortable fiction, transformation over perpetuation, the lines lighten. Not erasing, history cannot be erased, but becoming integrated rather than toxic, acknowledged rather than secretly poisonous, transformed from curse into cautionary tale that prevents future atrocities. This is the ultimate gift Nazi descendants offer humanity, proof that even from history's greatest darkness, light can emerge. That confronting rather than hiding from terrible truth creates possibility for healing. That we are not doomed to repeat our ancestors' sins, but can consciously choose different paths. That courage to face inherited darkness leads to freedom those who hide can never know. The journey is not complete. It will never be complete. As long as anyone carries Nazi ancestry, the burden exists. But burden can be carried with dignity rather than shame, with purpose rather than paralysis, with transformation rather than perpetuation. The children and grandchildren of Nazis who chose this harder path created maps through darkness for anyone who follows, proving that even the most poisoned inheritance can nurture growth when tended with honesty and courage.